Hi, if you like the video, please remember to subscribe. Hi, I'm Rob from robnophoto.com, and in today's beginner's guide I'm going to be talking about autofocus points on your DSLR, because in the world of digital photography, one of the main standards that we judge our photos by is sharpness, and the first building block for sharpness towards creating an apparently sharp photo is simply getting your subject in focus, focusing on the right thing. Because, as we know, what happens when we go to take a photo, our cameras kind of they make a funny noise, the lens moves in and out, and you normally hear a beep, and then you know it's okay to press the shutter button halfway down. Yet focus and more importantly autofocus points can be a really confusing part of learning to use our camera. Why should we use different autofocus points? And many of us and me included, we kind of stay planted, we stay fixed to the center autofocus point, which, although often it's the most fastest and most accurate autofocus point our camera can use, it means we're missing out on the advantage of using some of the other autofocus points around the periphery of the viewfinder and our composition. So to kind of take a step back a bit, autofocus points are those little boxes that you can see when you look through the viewfinder that light up when you half press the shutter. When you half press the shutter, your camera tries to focus, sets exposure, and then it waits for you to press the button all the way down to take focus. Now, when you're in auto mode, the camera chooses which one of those autofocus boxes to use, and normally it's the closest subject that it will focus on. But when we move on to program mode or the creative modes like aperture priority mode, shutter priority mode, or manual mode, we can then choose our autofocus points. And how many autofocus points your camera's got, you'll have to see your manual. Old autofocus film SLRs, the first ones that came out used to just have one autofocus point, and then 3, then went up to 5, then 9. Modern DSLRs tend to have at least 9, but if something like the top of the range Canon 1DX has 61 autofocus points. So really there's no excuse for not knowing how to at least select different autofocus points, so you can change them and really benefit your photography that way. So I guess the first question I've got to answer is, why shouldn't you just use the center AF point, especially if it's the most accurate and the fastest one of your camera? Well, it is true. The one in the middle is often the best autofocus point that your camera's got, and then depending on how much your camera costs, more of the others will be just as good, or they'll just be single line focus points, which means that they'll still work, but not quite as well. Well, the main reason is because if you only use the center focus point, you're going to have to use something called focus and recompose, aren't you, to compose your photographs, unless you always take your photos with the main subject bang in the middle. But we know that having the main subject of a photo right in the middle can be a little bit boring and a bit snapshotty. So we always want to put the main subject over to one side, don't we? So in order to do that, if we're just using the center autofocus point, we've got to focus and recompose. So you've got to aim your camera, with the center autofocus point over your subject, press the shutter button halfway down, get the focus beep, and then you've got to move your camera to get the composition you want. But the problem with that is that as you move your camera like that, you're changing the composition, but you're also obviously changing the light that's coming into your camera too, aren't you? And often you'll find your exposure for the whole scene will be adversely affected by focus and recompose. Most commonly, you get skies that are blown up. So you've got your main subject in the middle of your scene, and you focus on them, and let's say they're standing and there's a bright sky. And then you recompose. Now there's more of the sky in the photo now, so really you'd want to dampen down the exposure a little bit so you get some detail in the sky. But because you've already set your exposure and your focus by just using the center focus point, you lose that, and that can be quite frustrating, and sometimes it can be really bad, especially if you've got things like bright sun in the sky. However, you also need to remember that it's not just the sky and exposure that can be affected by focus and recompose. Your actual focus can be affected as well. So let's think about a situation where you're shooting a macro photograph, say of a flower that is very close to you. If you focus on it and then you move your camera, especially if you're using a large aperture to get a really small depth of field, that small movement in your camera will affect the plane of focus. And that thing you wanted in focus, say the stamens on the flower, could well drop out of focus, and you'll lose the sharpness of the image. It can also happen in portrait photography as well. So let's say you focus in on the eye of your subjects, they're really close, and using like a 1.8 lens, so your depth of field is millimeters long, and then you recompose, and that movement changes the plane of focus and you lose sharpness. Again, if your camera's on a tripod and it's locked down, focus and recomposing is really difficult because you physically got to move the camera on the tripod, take it off, and it can be a real pain. It would be so much easier if we simply change the autofocus point in our camera so it's nearer or spot on to where we want to focus, and then we're not going to affect the exposure and we're not going to affect the focusing either. All of this, however, is a lot easier said than done, but changing your autofocus points intuitively just comes down to practice. I'm sure you've probably got used to exposure compensation now. When you're in aperture priority mode or shutter priority mode, or and you're taking a photo of a scene, and you check on the LCD screen on the back, and you see that it's a little bit too light, it's a little bit too dark. So pretty quickly, you just stamp your finger on the exposure compensation button, you roll your mode dial one way or the other to lighten or darken the photograph, and you take the image again. And you probably don't even think about doing that now because you've done it so much. Now, if you practice and put into practice changing your autofocus mode, they will be just as quick and it will happen just as fast. Now, to change your autofocus points, you're gonna have to have a look at your camera manual, download it from the manufacturers or dig it out of the box if you still got it. But say, for example, on this old Canon 350D, all you do is there's a little button on the back in the top right hand corner which you press down, and then the way I do it is I look through the viewfinder, and then better turn it on first, don't I? You press it, and then you use the cross pads to select the autofocus point you want, and then you half press the shutter and it selected it. And now, instead of my camera focusing in the middle, it focuses on using the far right autofocus point. So it's really, really simple, and I'm pretty practiced at it now. So when I'm in a certain situation, when I'm moving from portrait to a landscape, my fingers flicking around on the autofocus point, choosing the one that's closest to my subject. And it really is just as simple as that. Just practice, 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 and you'll get faster and faster and faster. And it really will become second nature to do it. Now, there is a warning as well. And the warning is, when you do play around with autofocus points and you are changing them a lot, make sure that when you get to the end of the session, or when you get your camera out at the beginning of a new session, as part of your checklist, as part of the WIFE checklist, white balance, ISO, focus and exposure, with the focus part, double check that your autofocus point has gone back to the center AF point. That way, you won't go to focus on something expecting it to be in the middle one, and it's not, it's off to the right, and you'll get misfocusing, and it could cause you to miss some photos. So there we go. That's a brief beginner's introduction to autofocus points, why you should think about using another autofocus point than just the one in the middle, and hopefully I've kind of inspired you to find out how to do it on your camera and do a bit of practicing as well. Well, my name's Rob from robnowphoto.com. If you like the videos, please subscribe. You can always email me, scalespeed@gmail.com. Put some comments in the comment section below, and hopefully I'll see you again soon.